All right. Well, good evening, everyone. So I'm Dr. Billy Teets of the Vanderbilt University Dyer Observatory. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual edition of our November Telescope Night. Tonight we're going to be talking about some of the tips for buying a telescope and some other observing aids. I'd like to start off by first thanking my colleagues here at the Vanderbilt University Dyer Observatory, Alex Rockefeller, Helen Morissette, and Nathan Griffin, who've been helping to get programs like this going, and also Brian Smokler, who's with VU News and Communications, and he's making sure that our signal is getting broadcast out to you all tonight. So a little bit of an announcement here. So make sure to check out our webpage, which is dyer.vanderbilt.edu. And when we have upcoming events, whether virtual or in person, we will post details about those events on our homepage. We don't have any in-person events coming up as of yet, but we do have a couple of events that will be coming up in December. 2 talks by folks here at Vanderbilt University, and we will also have our December virtual telescope night, or a virtual star party, I should say. And then we will likely have another viewing event around December 21st. So I'm not going to spoil the fun by telling you all the details about that, but just be sure to check out our website for that. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the discussion. So as you're probably very well aware, tonight we are going to be talking about some tips for buying a telescope. So the way we're going to do this tonight, Alex and Helen will be monitoring our YouTube stream for questions. And as we're going through our discussion tonight, I'm not going to try to take up too much time by talking. I'm going to do some demonstrations, kind of show you some of these different items, and we'll talk about some of the benefits and things. But we'll probably be doing questions during the presentation as well, instead of waiting to the very end. So if we have an onslaught of questions at one point, we'll try to get to at least a few of those. And then we'll make note of those questions and get back to them at the end. So if we didn't get to your question, just hang tight and we'll do that in consideration of time. I do want to start out by saying that the information that I'll be giving tonight, a lot of it is based on my own personal experience. Others may have had different experiences, but when we're talking about how to get the right telescope or what to look for when getting a telescope or other observing aids, there's often no one single correct answer. So just kind of take that into consideration. And we'll also be showing a few different brands or models of telescopes and observing aids. And myself or Vanderbilt or Dyer Observatory, we are not endorsing any particular ones of these. We're not getting commissions or anything like that. I'm just using them for demonstration purposes. So our outline for tonight. So we're going to talk about some of the basic background about telescopes, such as the main types, some of their advantages and disadvantages. We'll even get into things like the different types of mounts. And we'll also give some recommendations on these things. We'll also be talking about some of the observing aids that you can get in addition to a telescope. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the targets that you can observe with these particular things and what you can expect to see and maybe what you won't expect to see. And then finally, as we've talked about before, we'll definitely be doing some question and answer and you know, kind of showing each of these telescopes kind of one-on-one there. So very basics of a telescope. Well, there are several main groups of telescopes. The first and probably the most famous is the refracting telescope. And so in this diagram, you see on the left an actual refracting telescope, and on the right side, you see a cutaway view of this style of telescope. And so the main components of this style are a large lens or couple of lenses at the very front, which are called the objective lens. They're responsible for gathering light and focusing it down to a second lens, which is called the eyepiece. And then there's basically a tube that is going to hold these components in alignment with one another so that we can actually see the image. Now, again, this is one of the most famous types of telescopes. It was the first to be invented. And again, typically what people will think of when they hear the word telescope. one of the big drawbacks of this type of telescope is something known as chromatic aberration. Oops. So chromatic aberration is a color distortion. So on the left side view, we're looking through a small telescope that is really suffering from this color distortion, or this chromatic aberration. On the right side is kind of a diagram showing how white light, when it goes through a prism, breaks up into its various components. So what I want you to notice is that, with this prism here, it's in the shape of essentially a triangle. Now, if I go back one slide, look at this objective lens. Look right up there, right where I'm circling. Notice how that objective lens is essentially a triangle in shape. So one of the issues with these types of telescopes is that they often suffer from this type of color distortion. There are ways to combat this. One of the main ways is to actually take not one, but two lenses of differing materials and combining them at the front of the telescope. So as the light enters the first lens and starts to break apart, the second lens will catch that light and kind of reconverge it into more of a white light. Now, it won't do this perfectly, but there are telescopes that get quite expensive, which really alleviate this chromatic aberration. I'll give you an example. This is a typical, or I shouldn't say a typical, but this is an example of a refracting telescope. So if I turn it towards you, you can see the glare from the lens up at the front here. And then at the back, we've got our eyepiece. Now this particular one, like we also illustrated in that previous slide, it has a 90-degree component to it. So this is often referred to as a star diagonal or a 90-degree angle. And so this basically just redirects the light so that you don't have to essentially crane your neck in order to look through this telescope comfortably. Okay. Now this one, I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but it says achrome on the front, or acro on the front of it. That stands for achromat. So this telescope has a set of lenses at the front that will really reduce, but not completely eliminate, that color distortion. Okay. There are other types known as apochromatic refractors, and those do an even better job. So for those really expensive versions of these refractors, you can really reduce that color distortion to where you don't really notice it. The drawback is that you pay for that because you have to grind lenses. Each lens has its own two surfaces. So that means that these telescopes have to have lenses that have 4 perfectly curved surfaces that are made out of specific materials of a very high quality. That's really going to add to the cost of that. So as Theo Wellington, who was one of our presenters at our last virtual star party, had said, a telescope, or a refracting telescope for an amateur, about the largest that you're probably going to see is about a 5-inch wide telescope. And when I say that, I mean that the lenses are about 5 inches wide. This one's about a 4-inch. Because once you get up about the 5-inch size, you're getting into some really costly telescopes. And we're talking easily over $10,000 just for the telescope itself. Okay, but you get really nice images, beautiful views of the planets. So if you're willing to pay it, then you can get a really nice view. But you don't have to go with the refractor to get a really nice view of the cosmos. So if we go back to our slide here, let's talk a little bit about another style of telescope. This is called the reflecting telescope. So as its name suggests, this type of telescope simply reflects the light. And in doing so, it's able to form an image. So in our diagram here, on the left side, we have a cutaway view of something called a Newtonian telescope. So the light would enter through this telescope opening, and it would intercept this primary mirror, which you notice has a curve to it. That curved mirror is able to focus light towards a second mirror. This one happens to be flat. Its job is just to redirect the light out the side of the telescope to our eyepiece. Now, I had mentioned that these are reflectors, yet this one has an eyepiece. When we're talking about a reflector versus a refractor or whatever type of telescope, we're not considering the eyepiece as well. We're just talking about the main part of the telescope. So for this example over on the right side, the light would enter in through the top of the telescope here. It would travel down to the bottom, hit that curved mirror, which would then focus the light back up towards the front. The second mirror is right in there, and it sends the light out to the side to the eyepiece. So one thing you'll notice is that the eyepiece and the opening, or the aperture as we call it, are both at the front of the telescope. So when folks first see this style of telescope, if they've never encountered it before, they will often bring this telescope down so that the top appears actually at the bottom, because they see the eyepiece there and figure that's the bottom of the telescope. So so this again is a type of reflecting telescope. Now this particular style of telescope is known as a Dobsonian telescope, and it's named after John Dobson. Now he didn't invent the actual telescope itself, but what he did popularize was this very simplistic base that it sets on. So it's what we call an out azimuth mount. So it basically moves up, down, left, and right. Because the mount and even the tube that's holding the mirrors can be made of relatively inexpensive materials, most of your money goes into the actual optics of the telescope. So these telescopes also tend to give a pretty wide field of view. Now on the left side there, that's what we would consider or often call a classic Dobsonian. Kind of looks like a cannon. On the right side is a truss design telescope. So instead of a solid tube, it now just uses a truss work to suspend the different components. And in fact, in this one, you can even, on the right, you can even see that secondary mirror right in there. And the eyepiece is right over here. So we have a few examples of these Newtonian, or what are often referred to as the Dobsonian telescopes. So again, the Dobsonian mainly refers to the base that it's setting on. Newtonian refers to the actual optical design. So Isaac Newton was the first to invent this optical design for a telescope. He invented the first reflecting telescope. Move this out of the way here. So on our tabletop, and I'll bring this closer in just a moment, this is what we would call a tabletop reflector. You notice that it's very short. It's pretty lightweight. I would say, I'd estimate it probably weighs about 15 pounds, but it's easily transported. Bring it up a little bit closer to where you can see it. Oops, I'm starting to get a little green screen effect there. But notice that it just moves up and down, and then the base, it can actually swivel around. So that is what we call an out azimuth mount. Very simple. All you got to do is just take it outside, set it down somewhere, and then start looking through the eyepiece. You don't have to worry about aligning or anything like that. Now, because this is a short telescope, it often helps to have a little table to set it on. So that can be a little bit of a disadvantage if you don't have one of those little tables handy or something. But I'll pull off the top here and give you an idea of how this works. So right up at the front here, where my finger is, that is the secondary mirror. And if I tilt it down, you'll see the reflection of that primary mirror in the back. So the light will enter in here, it'll travel down, reflect back up towards the front, and then out to the side. So again, it's a nice little tabletop reflector. Now this particular one is what we would say is a 4.5-inch telescope. We'll talk about aperture in just a moment, but when we talk about telescope size, we don't worry about how long it is or how heavy it is. We worry about how wide the opening is. You want to get as much light gathered as possible, and that's going to depend on the size of your opening, or your aperture as it's called. So again, this one is a 4.5-inch, which technically is about 113 millimeters wide. Give you another example here. This is another 4.5-inch Newtonian reflector, or Dobsonian reflector, however you want to call it. But you notice that this one is much longer. This one has what we say is a longer focal length. In the end, the only main difference is that you get a narrower field of view. Okay, so they're still great telescopes. This one is a little bit easier just to sit directly on the ground, especially if you're working with kids. Then they may have to stoop over just a little bit, but they can very easily move this around and look through it. Now, this style of telescope, you notice it's getting kind of big. It comes on its swiveling base. This style, though, you typically can very quickly undo 2 latches, or in this case 2 springs, and that will allow you to simply lift this off. This weighs, I would guess, probably 8 pounds, so very easy to transport. You can take this, you know, like especially if you're going out in the country somewhere and want to observe with it, it's very easy to take this off, set it in the back seat of the car, make sure to strap it down so it can't move around, and then simply just come back and get your base. In fact, this one is light enough, or this size is light enough, that, let me reassemble it here. And again, it's just a very quick assembly. You can even just carry it by the handle that it has on its back, okay? Now, we can quickly increase in size. For example, over here is a 12-inch, so its main mirror in the back is 12 inches. I'll bring it down to where you can kind of see here. Might be able to get a little bit of a view. Yeah, you can start to see the 12-inch mirror in the back there. This one is more of a beast. This one, it's not easy to carry out in a single piece. In fact, I would not recommend it. I mean, as in carrying it out in a single piece, but you can quickly disengage the springs and you can essentially bear hug it or even just carry it normal and take the base out and then come back, or take the tube out and then come back and get your base. These also, you can get from the manufacturer, basically tote bags. They're like big duffel bags. You lay it down on the ground, slide the tube in there, zip it up, and it's got 2 shoulder straps, so you can just sling it over your shoulder, which is actually much easier to transport these guys. So again, that is the Dobsonian telescope, and if we were going to recommend a telescope, that's the style that we would go with. They come in many different sizes, from the 4.5-inch size, either the short tube or the long tube. They can come in 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch, and we can go even higher than that. A small one like this is probably going to run you a little over $100. This one over here, probably about the same, but less than $200. If you go up to about a 6-inch, then you probably get over the $200 threshold. 8-inch, probably closer to $300. 10-inch, that one, depending on what the tube is made of, you can go between $400 and $500 typically. This one, even though it's 2 inches wider at 12 inches, it was substantially more. So it's kind of like a little bit of an exponential curve there. For size, I would probably, well, a 4.5-inch, especially if you've got somebody that is just getting into astronomy. Maybe it's a child or a grandchild, niece or nephew or something like that. You can start them out small. Each of these telescopes will easily get, for example, the moons of Jupiter or the rings of Saturn. You can even see some faint fuzzy objects if you've got dark locations to view from. But the bigger the telescope that you get, the more light you're going to gather and the more detail you're going to be able to see. So you could start out with a very small one and then later on upgrade and spend a little bit more money and get one of the larger ones. I've used all of those different sizes that I named off: 4.5, 6, 8, 10, and 12. And if you've got somebody that you know is going to be into astronomy or has already shown a very strong interest in it, putting a little bit of extra money in to maybe get an 8-inch telescope would be worth it, in my opinion. One thing I try to reiterate to people is that even though you may spend a little bit more money at the front, these telescopes, if you take care of them, which doesn't take much, they will literally last you a lifetime. Okay, and by taking care of them, I mean, once you're done with them, just put the little dust cover back on, maybe drape a little tarp or a bag over it just to kind of keep dust off the outside, which that's easily cleaned. Don't drop it or bang it against something if you are moving it around. And if you store it, just make sure that it really can't get water on it or extremely high humidity. So I have one that I stored in my garage, and I would just generally just drape a big trash bag over it. So, you know, even if they get a little dust on the mirror, that's fine. And speaking of which, these mirrors are not like the mirrors that you would have in your bathroom or like a makeup mirror, which is curved. Those mirrors all have a glass coating on the front. These mirrors are front aluminized, which means that the reflective aluminum coating, in fact, I've got one here, the reflective aluminum coating on these mirrors is directly on the surface. So if you touch it, you literally are touching the aluminum. These are extremely easily scratched. If I come up a little bit closer and I turn this, you'll see, let me try to get it out of my face there. You'll probably see some of the scratches on it. This is an old telescope mirror we pulled out of a telescope that was given to us. But when I say easily scratched, I do mean that literally taking a Kleenex and just lightly going across it, hold it in the light, you'll see the fine scratches. And I speak from experience on that. So there are ways to clean mirrors. I'm not going to go into that tonight, but there are good reliable sources online on how to do that. But the bottom line is, unless you've basically taken a handful of dust, like literally a handful, and just thrown it on your mirror, you're really not going to notice any image quality difference. So if it gets a little dust on there, don't worry about it. Okay, I know that's hard for some folks like myself. You know, I see the dust on it, I've got to clean it off, but it really will not make a difference in what you see. Okay. Let me go through one other bit here. So those were the Dobsonian telescopes, and again, this is the style that we would recommend, or at least I would recommend. There is another type of reflecting telescope. So ignore the telescope on the right for the moment, but look at the diagram on the left. This is what we call a Cassegrain reflector. So this one also has a big mirror in the back. This mirror has a hole in it though. And as you see in this cross section, when light comes in and reflects up to that second mirror, the mirror doesn't send the light out the side. It actually sends it back down through that hole and out the back to where the eyepiece would be. So this is an example of one of those telescopes. So the main mirror would be right in here. Second mirror would be right here. So the light comes in, hits that mirror, bounces up, bounces yet again, and then comes out the back to the eyepiece. So if you have been to the Dyer Observatory and observed through any of our large telescopes that were in one of our domes, you were observing through one of these Cassegrain reflectors. So these, because of the way the light is reflected a couple of times and because of the curvature of that second mirror, these telescopes they come in essentially a smaller physical package, and these are great for doing, especially if you're wanting to get into photography work, which we'll touch on in a little bit. Now on the right, this is a variation of that. This is not just a Cassegrain telescope, this is a Schmidt-Cassegrain. So the Schmidt part comes from the fact that this one has this glass corrector plate right at the front. Okay, so that's called the Schmidt corrector. And these were corrector plates that were required for this style of telescope when mirrors were first being ground to form these reflecting telescopes. The problem was that the curvature that was being used to shape these mirrors would not allow them to focus light properly. It would be a little bit out of focus. And so these corrector plates were essentially like a pair of glasses for the telescope. Had the added benefit of, instead of having to use supports, like rod supports to hold this second mirror, you could use the glass itself, which also helped to keep dust off of that very scratchable mirror at the back. So again, these are good for visual work, but they're also good for photographic work. So if you were really trying to get into astrophotography, this would be probably one of your be on your short list for a type of telescope. I do have a couple of examples of those telescopes, which, by the way, when we incorporate reflectors and some sort of a lens like a corrector plate, so that we're basically merging the properties of reflecting and refracting telescopes, we get the third group of telescopes, which is known as the catadioptrics. Okay, so a regular Cassegrain like this guy doesn't have that corrector plate. He would just be a reflector. Okay, but there are a couple of different types of these catadioptrics that you might come across if you're looking for a telescope. I'll go ahead and say that the catadioptrics tend to be on the higher side when you compare sizes of telescopes in catadioptrics versus, say, the reflectors. Okay. Over here, this is one of those Schmidt-Cassegrains. So I will turn it here. Hopefully you can see it a little bit. Let me try to adjust this just a bit as well. So you'll notice right there is the reflection of that second, or that primary mirror. The secondary mirror is right up here, and then there's this glass corrector plate on the front. So that's one style, that's the Schmidt-Cassegrain. And then this little guy here, which is a really cute little telescope called a Questar. This one is another style called a Maksutov-Cassegrain. So this one, it's also got the mirror at the back, which you can see the reflection there. This little spot up here behind that is the secondary mirror. But this one's corrector plate. I don't know if I can show it very well. It's kind of hard to see, but it's got what's known as a meniscus lens at the front. So it's not a flat lens. It's kind of like a bowl shape. And that's another one of those corrector lenses. So this one, it's really cute, and these are also good for photographic use, but because you've got to have this very specific curvature of this front lens, that can add to the cost as well. But I just wanted to throw that out there in case you come across those and wonder what they're, what we're actually looking at. So now, as we mentioned before, bigger tends to be better for telescopes. So not only are you increasing the opening to let more light in, but you're also increasing the resolution of your telescope. So for example, if you had really good sky conditions, the atmosphere is very calm, and you looked at Saturn with, say, a 4-inch telescope, and then you looked at Saturn again with a 12-inch telescope, and you had your eyepieces set up so that you had the same magnification for both. What you would see is that to the 12-inch, you would get better detail on Saturn. You'd be able, in fact, you'd be able to zoom in just a little bit more and still be able to resolve some features of Saturn's rings, for example. And not only that, but through the, let's say the 4-inch, you might see 1 or 2 of Saturn's moons, whereas through the 12-inch, you'd probably see about 4 or 5. But of course, if you get a bigger telescope, that means it's going to increase the cost as well. So there's kind of a trade-off there. When we talk about telescope aperture being critical, that's one of the big things that large observatories are concerned with. So for example, on the right side is an artist rendering of the Giant Magellan Telescope, which is essentially 7 telescope mirrors put together to form a much larger mirror. And on the left is just one of those mirrors. And so you can see how large it is compared to the audience or to the scientists behind them. So, and even for amateurs, they can get something called aperture fever. So for example, this is one of those truss Dobsonians. I believe this one was close to 48 inches in diameter, if I recall correctly. And typically had to be disassembled to be transported. And then there was, it essentially took up a whole garage there. But, we can, those that really get into astronomy, they're essentially never satisfied with the size of the telescope. So they get the 10-inch telescope, then they wonder, well, what can I see with a 12-inch telescope? Or what about a 16-inch? So one other thing I want to mention about aperture size. In most cases, aperture size is, bigger is better. However, let's say you're in downtown Nashville. You also need to take into account your viewing location. So if you're planning on observing strictly from downtown Nashville, a 12-inch telescope isn't really going to get you anything more than, say, a 4-inch telescope because there's so much light pollution. So, but if you've got a good dark location, maybe out in the country somewhere where you can see the Milky Way overhead, then a bigger telescope would benefit you. And if you don't have a location that you can always observe from, you can also look up astronomy events like star parties. So for example, typically, well, this is pre-COVID times, there would be 2 star parties out at Fall Creek Falls, which is over towards East Tennessee. And there are some of the darkest skies there in Tennessee. And so amateur astronomers would bring their telescopes there, they'd set them up, and they would observe all night. And one of the nice things about that is, even if you didn't have a telescope, you'd be welcome to go to that star party and look through other people's telescopes. So if you're not really sure, which size telescope you want to go with, one thing that you could do is go to one of these star parties and actually get to look through some of the different size telescopes to get a feel for what each size would get you. Other astronomers there might be doing astrophotography, and so you can kind of get some insights on that and kind of see the equipment that they're using. So like the Barnard Seaford Astronomical Society is one of the local astronomy clubs here in Nashville. Memphis has the Memphis Astronomical Society, which is a participant in our virtual star parties. But they do these kinds of things where they have these star parties where people are just invited to come. Or, you hear about it and they say, we're going to be here for a certain period of time, so come on out and check it out. And, the amateur astronomers there love to talk about the telescopes and what they're looking at. And they, love educating people about this because it's what they are very passionate about. So now, one final thing about telescopes, and then we're going to move on to some observing aids. You may see the different types of mounts. For example, when we were looking at the refractor, you notice that its mount, let me back it up here, its mount looks a little bit strange. So this mount, you notice that it's one of its axes of rotation right through here. This is its main axis of rotation. This is known as a German equatorial mount. Now, this style of mount is not really meant to just be plopped down and you start observing with it. You can if you want to, but it's not really meant for that. This is meant to be aligned so that as you turn this knob, or there's another knob on the other side here you can't really see very well, but as you gently turn those or even attach a motor to it, it will track the object that you're looking at. So you don't have to keep adjusting as this object is moving across the sky. But again, that requires alignment. Now, one of the reasons that we recommend the Dobsonian telescope is because, as we saw, it has a very simple base. In fact, if I go back to our diagram here, so here is our equatorial mount here. So again, it's going to require the user to align it so that the telescope can track properly. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but that makes it so much easier to move the telescope around and find objects. The type of mount that the Dobsonian has is what we call the alt-azimuth mount, because it moves in altitude, which is up and down. So if we go back to our little tabletop example, so altitude is just moving up and down, and then azimuth is moving left and right. So again, these don't really require a setup, especially this particular kind, because it doesn't have any computer or anything on it. You are basically going to be moving it to what you want to look at. And actually, having said that, a number of manufacturers will have these, classic Dobsonians, which you just sit down and move around yourself. They'll have some that are like, I think it's the Orion company has something called the Telescope, and it looks a lot like these, except it has a little computer pad. Now, the telescope doesn't actually move, but once you get it aligned, which is relatively easy, the computer will then tell you where to move that telescope. It'll tell you to move it up, down, or left and right, and it's basically keeping track as you move it. So it doesn't move it for you, but it tells you how to move it. And because these guys have pretty wide fields of view, I've used them before, and they're pretty accurate. So that might be an option if you actually want to try to find some of these things with the assistance of a computer. And there are even the versions that are automated, so they do have the motors. But again, adding any of these bells and whistles is going to really increase the cost dramatically. And again, the telescope is only going to be good at finding stuff as well as that it's aligned. So if it's got poor alignment, chances are you're not going to get to see the object that you're looking for, and it's going to be a disappointment and ends up with frustration. So we also recommend, or I should say I also recommend, not going with that in-telescope model or the go-to models. I highly recommend, especially for those who are just starting out, to get one of the very simple ones. So it's not going to cost you a lot of money, and you have to do all the object finding. And the reason I recommend that is that you don't have to worry about the frustration about computers, but it forces you to learn the sky. So going back about 20 years ago, that's when I got my first Dobsonian. And just taking it out in the yard and getting my little star map and learning some of the stars, and then saying, okay, I want to try to find this little cluster of stars. So I would then have to then manually move the telescope and locate my first bright star, and then say, okay, now I got to go down a little bit till I find this star, then hang a right, go over 2 more stars, and there's my cluster. So when I would do that and I would finally arrive at my target, it was so satisfying. We have telescopes here at Dyer Observatory that, you know, at the push of a button, it will find whatever object we want and have it centered. I could be at those telescopes all night, and I would get pretty bored very quickly just having it go and find all these different objects. But then if I have to find 2 objects on my own, I get so much more satisfaction. So again, that's another reason why you want to go with the simpler one, especially if you're just starting out with this. Then afterwards, if you want to get something that's more automated, then try that. So back to just a couple more slides here. Let's just mention a few of the observing aids. So when you get your telescope, it will often come, it typically always comes with at least 1 eyepiece. In some cases, it'll come with 2 eyepieces. When you get your telescope, you also maybe want to look at considering, or maybe want to consider getting 1 or 2 other eyepieces. And so there are a tremendous number of eyepieces out there. And they come by different names like Plossl or Kellner or Negler. And all of those are referring to different optical designs of the eyepieces. And so some of the, as you can see in the picture here, they really can vary in physical size as well. That doesn't mean necessarily that one will magnify more than the other, but it will change the field of view. So for example, this very large eyepiece on the right here, this one actually would have about the same magnification as this eyepiece. However, when I would look into this eyepiece, and I've had the opportunity to do this, the field of view is so wide that I would literally have to move my head around a little bit in order to see the entire field of view that's being shown to me. Whereas the little Plossl down here, it's a good eyepiece, but it has a narrower field of view. So it looks more like you're looking through a tube. Okay, so you can see the edge of the field of view much more easily in one of these guys than you can in like this big one up here. They come in a few different sizes. The most common are the 1¼ and 2 inch. So when you get your telescope, make sure that your telescope is set up to where or let me rephrase that. Make sure that if you want to get new eyepieces for your telescope or additional eyepieces, that you get the right size, because some telescopes can only accept the 1¼ inch eyepieces. They won't be able to accept a 2 inch eyepiece because it's too wide. Which, by the way, when we say 2 inch, we mean the actual width of the barrel down here. Okay. Now, some like the, give you another little view here. So like our big guy here, the telescopes, especially the larger aperture telescopes, they are typically made to accept both of those eyepieces. So this one has a much wider opening. It will accept an eyepiece like this one right here. So this is one of those 2 inch eyepieces. Okay. So I can just pop it in right in there, set the thumb screw, and I'm good to go. I can focus a little bit if I need to. But say I bought this eyepiece and I wanted to put it on here. Well, unfortunately, This little telescope is only made to accept the 1 1/4 inch eyepieces. I'll give you a little view of that. So there's the opening, 1 1/4 inches. Here's my big eyepiece there. So it won't work on that, okay? Now my big guy over there, it accepts the 2 inch. It'll even accept the 1 1/4 inch. You may say, well, how does that work? Because it's so much smaller. They will typically come with a little adapter. It's basically a spacer, okay? So this is 2 inches wide right here. I pop my 1 1/4 inch in there, snug down the thumb screw so it can't fall out, and then that will then slide into the telescope over there. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at getting a telescope. Now we recommend having at least 2 or 3 eyepieces and getting eyepieces of different focal lengths. So typically these eyepieces are listed by their focal length. For example, what we see in this view here, this middle eyepiece, if you can see it on your screen, it says 26 millimeter. That's the focal length of that eyepiece. This one is 6.4 millimeter. So the focal length will determine your magnification. In fact, you can calculate it for yourself. Your telescope will have listed on it somewhere its focal length. Take the telescope focal length divided by the number on your eyepiece. That gives you your magnification. Okay, so if your telescope has 1,000 millimeter focal length and you put in the 10 millimeter eyepiece, 1,000 divided by 10 is 100. So you have 100 magnification. Let's see, some of the things that might be mentioned are the field of view and the eye relief. So if you have a large field of view, that's like this one eyepiece on the right. It has a pretty large field of view. So it really gives kind of a breathtaking view when you look into these. It's not just like looking through a straw. It's like putting your eye up to a window and trying to look out and see everything. The eye relief, that is how close your eye has to get in order to see the full field of view. So, you know, you don't want to have your eyeball smashed up against the eyepiece. So if you have an eyepiece that's advertising good eye relief, then that might be something to consider. The other thing is when you are using these eyepieces, oops, hold on one second. Start out with your lowest magnification, which means the biggest number. So if I have a 10 millimeter and a 25 millimeter eyepiece, I would start out with the 25 millimeter because it'll give me my lower magnification. And then I get my object centered that I want to look at. And then I take that eyepiece out and I put in my 10 millimeter. So don't really ever start out with your low or your highest magnification because you'll have a heck of a time trying to find what you're looking for. Also keep in mind that magnification is not the key here. Like I said before, we can bring the magnification of these telescopes up easily to 1,000 power, but the views would be horrible, okay? So some of the best views are actually at the lowest magnifications. So when you see these telescopes advertised in department stores, and it says, we'll magnify 500 times, well, you can do that with any telescope, and the view will be terrible, okay? So ignore the magnification. And again, lowest magnification is often better. In addition to some of the eyepieces, you can also get something called a Barlow lens. And this will essentially double the number of eyepieces that you have because it just simply fits onto the end of one of your eyepieces and it will either double, triple, or even quintuple the magnification of that eyepiece. So I'll give you an example. Here's a little 2x Barlow, which means it'll, whatever magnification we originally had, it'll multiply it by a factor of 2. So here's my 25 millimeter eyepiece. Let's say this gave me a magnification of 100. If I slip this guy right on there, get my set screw, snug down my set screw, then I put that into where the eyepiece goes on the telescope. Now instead of 100 magnification, I would have 200 magnification. I've got one, I don't have it here with me, but it's a 3x. So if I had used that one instead, then I would have a 300 magnification. Okay, so if you've got an assortment of eyepieces, which by the way, you can get these in 1.25" or 2" then by getting a Barlow, you've essentially doubled the number of eyepieces that you have. Okay. Another key item I would highly recommend is a moon filter, especially if you get a telescope that's a little bit larger. That moon, especially when it's getting close to full, is going to be really bright in your field of view. Switch back over here. So here is where there it goes. So here's a moon filter. Let me stick a piece of paper to me so you can kind of see what it does here. Okay, so now if I hold this up, you'll notice that the view is a little bit darker through that filter. So that's going to attenuate the light of the moon just a little bit. Now you can get them where it's just this, and you basically just screw it onto the end of your eyepiece and put that in your telescope, and so your view is a little bit dimmer. Or you can even get those that are called variable polarizers, and I really like these because if you've got a full moon, you want more dimming, but if you've got maybe a first quarter moon, maybe you don't want as much dimming. So it's essentially just 2 of these that you can screw together. Okay, let me adjust this here. Okay, so if we look through here, maybe that's what I want, but maybe the moon is getting brighter and I want a little bit more dimming, so I just turn one of those rings and it lets less light through. Okay, and again, this whole thing just screws onto the end of your eyepiece. By the way, never use these to try to view the sun. Okay, even if you brought it down to maximum attenuation, it would still cause irreparable eye damage. So never use the moon filters for the sun. You have to have a special filter for that, which by the way does not go on the end of the telescope or on the end of the eyepiece. It actually goes on the end of the telescope itself. I don't have one with me tonight, but we can discuss that a little bit later if need be. All right. We've had questions before about binoculars. So binoculars are nothing to be scoffed at, especially if you're in a really good dark location. They're some of the easiest things to use. You don't have to worry about taking out a base and setting that up. You can just hang it on a strap around your neck and just walk out and take a look. But these offer a much wider field than the telescopes themselves. And so scanning things like the Milky Way, that will give you some just absolutely gorgeous views of the Milky Way that you're not going to be able to see in the telescope because you're looking at too small of an area at one time with the telescope. There are a couple of numbers that are on binoculars. In fact, I've got an example here. Let me bring it over. Now this pair of binoculars, this is an astronomy pair of binoculars. As you can see, they're pretty long, which means they're also going to be heavy. These, you can get a little bracket that will mount it to a tripod. It's not the best for trying to view directly overhead, but if you're looking out on the horizon or maybe about halfway up in the sky, then the tripod's really nice and it can hold it very steady for you, and you don't have to, your arms don't have to worry about getting tired. So that's another consideration. You know, even a light pair of binoculars over time will start feeling really heavy. So, but there are 2 numbers that'll be listed on your pair of binoculars. This is a pair of 15 by 70s. The 15 means it's going to magnify 15 times. The 70 refers to the diameter of our lenses in millimeters. So if it was a 15 by 100, then that'd be an even wider pair, which would allow you to get more light, which might make the objects in the sky brighter, but it would also make them heavier. So, you know, these are, even though they're astronomy binoculars, they'd be great for terrestrial viewing, like bird watching or whatever. But just keep in mind that, you know, for binoculars, bigger is kind of better until you have to hold them for a while. So, and there's a lot of different opinions about, you know, the different types of binoculars. So what I would recommend is just going on one of these websites, like maybe Orion's website or Celestron or Meade or any of these manufacturers of binoculars. look at the reviews. I know that like on the Orion site, a lot of people put in their reviews, and it's not just like, yeah, this is a nice pair of binoculars. They actually go into depth about, you know, oh, I bought this and they were remarkably light and I really enjoy using them at night. So really, for something like that, I would highly recommend seeing what other people who have actually used a certain pair you're interested in have to say about them. But these are great for astronomy. Okay, you're not going to be able to zoom in on Saturn with them, but they'll give you some really gorgeous views that you just can't get with a telescope. Okay, something like the Pleiades star cluster. You can get a couple of the stars of that cluster in one of these telescopes, but you can get the whole thing with a pair, even a small pair of binoculars, and it's much more breathtaking than the view that you get with your telescope. Okay. All right. I think I've got just like 2 or 3 more slides here. Some other recommended accessories are a red flashlight, maybe a few star maps or field guides, things like, you know, you can even get a moon map to learn what some of the craters on the moon are named or how big they actually are. You'd be surprised at how big they actually are, even though they look so tiny in the telescope. A planisphere, also known as a star wheel, which I'll show you in just a moment. And there's also lots of software out there, especially free software. So if you've got a laptop or a desktop, I'd highly recommend something like Stellarium. It's free for all of the operating systems. I think there's a phone version as well, although I don't know how well that works. But there's also apps like Star Walk, or I think there was a Sky View, or there's lots of these apps out there where you can basically just hold up your phone to the sky or your iPad or whatever and move around, and it basically shows you the sky. And they're really nice and accurate. So we often get asked, you know, is there one over the other that you prefer? Not really. I mean, they all have, they're all phenomenal bits of software, and some of them may have more bells and whistles than the other. But you know, I think that you could really just download any of them, especially if they're getting decent reviews, and you'd be set. But the star wheel, this is another handy tool for learning the night sky. This is a really nice, I'm starting to get a reflection there. Oops, I'm really getting a green screen. But basically what it is it's showing, it's got all the constellations and stars and things that you'd be able to see from a location like Nashville. You can get them from the southern hemisphere, but you'd want the northern hemisphere for Nashville, obviously. But around the perimeter, there is a dial that's got dates, and then it's kind of hard to see here because of the green screening effect, but there are times. And basically, if I wanted to say, well, what's it going to look like tonight, November 19th at 8 p.m., I would just rotate my dial around. Let's see, well, first I need to find November 19th, so right there on my dial. And then I'll rotate it around so that the 8 p.m. arrow is pointing at that date. And then that's what you've got shown in here. So this window here, everything that's in this window is what's up in the sky at that date and time for this location. So it lists off a number of the stars, it shows the constellations, shows some deep sky objects as well. So it's a great quick way for learning the sky if you don't want to drag out a computer or some books or anything like that. In fact, this one is plastic, so you don't have to worry about dew forming on it. If you go to our webpage, dyer.vanderbilt.edu, we still have, from our virtual star party, we have links to our own star wheel that you can download and print for yourself. We've also got a link to our last star party video where Adam Thans goes through how to actually use one of these. And so there's also a video showing how to assemble one, which it's very simple, but they're very, very effective tools. And as mentioned before, a light, not a white light like we have here, but a red light is really great for astronomy. We want red because when we're in a dark location and we're trying to see these faint objects, the color receptors of your eye are useless in the telescope, those what we call the cones. However, the rods in your eye, which kind of surround that central area of your eye, those are very well suited to dark locations, and they are very, very sensitive. And so that's what you're actually using when you look in a telescope and are looking at, say, the Andromeda galaxy. So the red light will not really stimulate those and wreck your night vision, but it will be enough red light to stimulate the cones so that you can see your way around. And when you get to the wherever you want to be, then you turn that off and your eyes are still set for viewing through the telescope. If we use the white light, then your cones would be stimulated, your rods would be stimulated as well, and that would wreck your night vision for about 10 to 15 minutes. So you want red light, you don't want to use like a green light or a blue light. The red light is really the one that you want, okay? And I think final thing is we just recently got asked about a recommendation for a book, and there's lots of different resources out there. First and foremost, I would recommend looking at getting either Astronomy or Sky and Telescope magazine, or you can get them both. They are chock full of information, different information every month. It goes into some of the science of and the fields of astronomy that are going on today. You'll see star charts for each month that the issue is. For example, this is, what month is this? So this is August of a few years ago, so you would find a star chart for that particular month. There'd be objects highlighted that you can look for, reviews about astronomy equipment, other guides, so it's just lots of different information in these. So I'd highly recommend getting one or both of these. There's also things like little field guides, so you can get individual constellations shown and some information about those, or maybe individual objects within those constellations. And there are a number of those out there. There's also like a stargazing guide, and I'm not recommending any particular one here, but these will have information about like movements of the sky, telescopes, some of the different things that you can observe, and yeah, it's just a lot of information as well. And then there are also atlases, which are great if you've got your telescope and you want to start finding some of these objects. So this particular one has individual images of the constellations, and then there are corresponding maps as well to show you where some of the highlighted objects are located. And so this would be a great way to find some of these objects. Let me make sure, okay. Switch back over. So what can you expect to see? First off, don't expect to see images like you saw on the Hubble Space Telescope webpage. Even if you were to look at, say, an amateur astronomer's website where they post pictures of images that they've acquired, even, well, let me back up and say that these really gorgeous images that you see, those are images that where the telescope and camera have taken long exposures that were often hours to, when you tally up all the observing time, sometimes even into days of exposure time. So you're never going to look into a telescope and see like this beautiful spiral galaxy just beaming away like you would see in a Hubble Space Telescope image. You'll be able to see some galaxies and they'll look like faint smudges. And if you happen to be in a very dark location with a large telescope, sometimes you can see spiral structure in those, but you're never going to see these extremely colorful images in the telescope like you see on the internet or in magazines or books. So, and the reason for that is that your eyes are just not sensitive enough. You have to have a lot of light to be able to stimulate the color receptors, those cones in your eye. So really the only time that you're really going to be able to notice color is when you're looking at the planets or even the stars. Some of these stars will look very blue or very yellow, sometimes even an orangey color. The planets, they aren't super colorful except for maybe Mars or Uranus or Neptune, but Saturn and Jupiter, they tend to have kind of a muted color. A lot of people ask where the color is. Why am I not seeing it in color? It's like, well, you are seeing it. It's just that a lot of the color images that you see are processed to help bring out details. So especially when you're looking through a reflecting telescope, remember there's no color distortion. You are seeing it as it is. Just sometimes it's too faint to see any color. Every once in a while, especially if you're looking in a very large telescope in a very dark location, you might be able to see a tiny bit of color in some of these faint fuzzy objects like these nebulae. There's been 1 or 2 times where I've seen some color in some of these planetary nebulae or even the Orion Nebula, but mostly they appear as kind of a grayish green color. Okay. When you're looking for faint objects, you want to use something called averted vision. So when you're looking straight at an object, then the light is being focused onto those very densely packed color receptors in your eye. So when you're looking at a galaxy in a telescope, if you look straight at it, it's going to be very hard to see because that light's going to those color receptors that just aren't responding because there's not enough light. However, if you look off to the side of the galaxy, and as we say, we look out of the corner of our eye at this object, all of a sudden it looks much brighter because now the light is falling onto the rods in your eye, which are more sensitive to the light. So you're not going to get high resolution viewing, you're not going to see color, but you're going to be able to detect them much better. So one thing to really look for is when you first get this telescope, I would look for the planets. Also start looking for these Messier objects. They're named after Charles Messier, who is a French astronomer from the late 1700s, early 1800s. And he made a catalog of about 110 of these objects. And he found these faint fuzzy objects as he was searching for these other fuzzy objects, which we now call comets. But he kept coming across these objects that weren't moving over the course of a few nights like comets normally do. So he made a note of where they were so that if he came across them again, he would immediately know if that was something he's already seen and dismissed as not being a comet. But they're galaxies, they're nebulae, they're star clusters, and they tend to be some of the brightest objects that you can see, especially with the small backyard telescope. In fact, around March of every year, the sun is in the right position among the stars that when it sets, it's possible, and you've got to be very determined to do this, and you have to stay up all night, but you can actually see all 110 objects over the course of the night from that sunset to the next sunrise. So it's called a Messier marathon. And that's often when we have these spring star parties where astronomy groups like the Barnard-Seaford Astronomical Society get together and do these star parties, and they try to see how many of these objects they can get. Can't use one of those robotic telescopes because that's cheating, because it'll go to every one of them. So it's the whole game of trying to find these objects, which makes it so much more fun than being just shown each one of them by a robotic telescope. So let's see. One final little thing here. We didn't talk too much about photography. Doing long exposure photography requires a good setup. So it's going to be one of these situations where if you want to get one of those really gorgeous pictures, let's say like the picture that's on the cover of this book here, that's going to require a telescope that is very well aligned, so it tracks the stars very, very well. It's going to require better equipment. It's more sensitive. It's going to require dark sky conditions. So that's more getting into the advanced side. Okay, but there are a number of objects, especially with smartphones, that you can actually get images of. The moon is an easy one. The planets are pretty easy as well. I say easy in a relative manner. The moon is the easiest, but planets you can get with a smartphone. But there are even these little smartphone adapters where this is basically just, so here's my eyepiece for my telescope, I'm taking it off, and this particular one, it slips over that. It's got a little mechanism to tighten down on that. You pop that in your telescope, and so it will allow you to then, where's my phone go? Oh, lost my phone again. But let's imagine that this is my phone. It can just set my phone on it and get it positioned right. I don't have to worry about balancing it right. I just lay it down there and get it centered over the aperture, and then I can take a picture of the moon or Saturn or whatever. And if you have a telescope that will actually follow these objects, you know, some of the smartphones can do maybe up to like a 30-second exposure. You can even start to get some of these faint fuzzy objects. So they're not going to be super duper images, but still, it's really cool that you're able to get it even with a smartphone. So with that, I think that I have gone way over. Hopefully not, but let's go ahead and take some questions if we've got some.
Hey, Billy.
Hey.
We just have a few questions, so it shouldn't go too late. Kathy says, I live in Nashville. Any advice for observing from the city?
From the city, that's the tough part. If you're more around downtown, you'll still be able to get things like the planets and the moon, obviously. Fainter objects like nebulae and galaxies, that's going to be much more difficult. But one of the things that I really started looking for when I got my first Dobsonian telescope and was learning the night sky was going out and trying to find individual stars and constellations. And you may say, well, that sounds really boring. But what I was looking for were these double stars. So these are stars that are, in many of the cases that I was looking at, are physically orbiting around one another. Now, you won't actually see them orbiting, but they will appear next to one another in the telescope. And a lot of these you can actually see with the naked eye. And so what I was doing was trying to find all of these different double stars. And some of them are the components are pretty far apart, so it's easy to spot them. But others, they end up appearing so close together that in some cases, it really helps, it kind of tests your telescope's ability to resolve these particular pairs. And so I found it to be a lot of fun trying to find these double stars. You know, there are even things like asteroids, like Ceres or Vesta. If they happen to be up in the sky, you can actually observe those guys. They appear like little stars. They'll be somewhat faint. But if you're near the city, you should still be able to pick them out. It just might be a little bit harder to find them at first, since you've got to use other stars as references to find those. And there are also, you know, if you're not too terribly light polluted, you know, if you've got some light pollution, but not too terribly light polluted, you can also get filters for the eyepieces. There are these filters that are often referred to as sky glow filters. But basically what they're doing, when you look at them, they kind of look like a bluish color. So if you put them on your eyepiece and you look at the moon, it's going to give it kind of a blue hue. But these are mainly for trying to look at objects that are kind of these faint fuzzy objects, like these things I called like planetary nebulae. In fact, one of them, this is the Helix Nebula. That's an example of one. But what it will do, that filter, it blocks out most light except for certain colors or certain portions of the rainbow. And the colors it lets through are the colors that these nebulae tend to emit. And the colors it blocks out are the colors that are really prominent in city lights and street lights, especially like those orange sodium lights. It really won't let any of that through. So it tends to help make the sky appear a little bit darker and make your nebulae pop out just a little bit more. So it's not a cure-all. Like if you were in downtown, you'd still have a heck of a time even with one of the filters being able to see that. But it can help improve the views a little bit. We've got them here at the observatory, and it is pretty impressive what they can do if you've got the right filter. The better the filter, or what we say is the narrower the bandpass, the more expensive they end up being. But you know, it just goes to figure. So it is still possible to do some deep sky observing towards the city. It's just going to be harder to do.
I've seen through your telescope with the filter, and it really makes a huge difference. It really does. And isn't there a thing like baffling built into some telescopes that give you a surprisingly good image?
Yes. So let's see. I don't know. Well, this one might show it a little bit. So this is my little Schmidt-Cassegrain. I'm going to try to get right up to the camera, try to get a good view here. It's so hard to do. But actually you can kind of see it there. So you can see the reflection of the mirror in there. In fact, you can see my finger. Now you see that this spot right here, that's on the front. But you notice that my finger looks like it's going behind a black piece right there. That's actually a tube that is coming up from that central hole in this mirror. And it's called a baffle, and it is made, or it is put in there so that if you have, say, if you're looking right here and there's a street light over here, and you've got light coming in from that street light, that baffle tube prevents that light from being able to get down into the eyepiece. So some of that light may be able to enter the baffle tube, but it'll be coming in at an angle, and as it tries to reflect, there are ridges within that baffle tube that help to keep that light from getting any farther down. So basically, the only way light can get through, get down to the very bottom of that baffle tube is if your telescope happens to be looking at the object that is emitting that light. So yeah, the telescopes, they have ways of preventing the light from getting to the eyepiece. But the problem is when we have all this light going up into the atmosphere tends to scatter that light. So you're looking through some of that reflected light as you're looking at your object, and that reflected light is able to actually get down into the tube as well. So, but yeah, the baffles in the telescope help prevent stray light from getting in there. But if you're just in a light polluted area, it's hard to overcome. And you can overcome it a little bit with things like those filters.
I live next to an office park in Brentwood, and I was astonished how well I could see the Pleiades through my very inexpensive telescope because of the baffling. Greg asked, can the Dobsonian do photography?
The Dobsonians can do photography. If you have well, let me back up. If you want to do something like planetary photography, when you see these really nice images taken by amateur astronomers especially, of showing a really detailed image of Saturn, and you can see the rings very nicely, that's not a single shot. That is typically done by taking a video of Saturn, and we do this sometimes at our virtual star parties, but you take, let's say, a few thousand frames of a video, and as the air is moving across your field of view and it's getting in between you and Saturn, making Saturn kind of wobble a little bit, there are periods where the air will kind of stop a little bit, and you'll get a pretty good view of Saturn. And so if you take one of these videos, there are software packages, in fact, a lot of them are free, where the program will automatically go through and it will select out the best frames from that video, and it will then take those out and it'll stack them and average out a lot of the little inconsistencies and give you a much nicer final image. And so for like a Dobsonian, even if it's not tracking, since they have a wide field of view, typically you can put your camera in there and start the video, and as Saturn or whatever is drifting through, because the sky appears to move, then you can get that video, and then afterwards the software will go in and it'll be able to follow Saturn. And when it pulls out those frames, it'll then realign everything so that Saturn is, all the images are aligned directly on top of one another. So that's one way that you can do photography. The moon, because it's so bright, you can typically do single images of that, especially if you do wide field views. But you can do the same method of that tracking and stacking that we mentioned. The Dobsonians that can move by themselves, that have the computerized go-to function, they can track. The problem, though, is that because you have a very long telescope, if there's any subtle variation in how it moves, you've got a very long lever arm. So if you make a little bit of movement down here, it's going to result in the very far away in moving quite a bit. So doing long exposure photography is a little bit more difficult with a Dobsonian telescope because of that. So that's one reason why the Schmidt-Cassegrains are often the choice for this style of, or for especially long exposure photography, because they're very compact. So they don't have to worry so much about them kind of jiggling, if you will. So in short, yes, there are different ways that you can do photography with the Dobsonian. The planetary stuff is easier than the deep sky stuff, but You can also do, for example, short exposures, maybe like 30-second exposures, and just do multiples of those. And after you process them, then you can stack them. And so effectively 10 30-second exposures becomes a 5-minute exposure if they were all good exposures. There are some drawbacks to doing many little exposures, but still you can start to do some deep sky photography with that.
William asks, can DSLRs be used for astrophotography as well as dedicated cameras you had purchased for a telescope?
Yes, in fact, a lot of the manufacturers of telescopes, like or of cameras, like Canon, and even some of the telescope manufacturers themselves, they will have T-ring adapters. So you can either, like when we're looking at our eyepiece here, so this is our 2-inch eyepiece, and the chrome part is what slides into the barrel and you lock down. They'll have an adapter that it's basically this barrel, and then it's got a little T-ring on it that you can then lock into your camera. So you take the front lens assembly off and replace it with that T-ring adapter, and you just pop it in place where the eyepiece would be. And so it works really well. And let's see, what was the other part of the question? Was it about the dedicated? So you can get dedicated cameras for astronomy. They typically will have a barrel adapter with them, or they can be more permanently mounted to a telescope. Those tend to be made specifically for very long exposures, and so they will have electronic components called Peltier coolers that are built into those, so that as you're doing these long exposures, the heat that actually builds up on the detector chip can cause a false signal. It causes, in the image, it causes like a glow in the image. And so the Peltier cooler keeps that chip very cold, and therefore reduces that amount of noise. And so the dedicated astronomy cameras are really good at being able to compensate for that noise and giving you a much cleaner image. There are ways to counteract that when you're doing like DSLR. For example, you can do, let's say it was I've done this before when I was out of the country. I did a 45-minute exposure when I was down in Chile. I actually set up my camera outside and had it exposed for 45 minutes. And in the end, I got my image and I could see my star trails, but the image was really, wasn't grainy, but you could see there were a lot of red pixels and green pixels, and that's that noise that builds up. So then what I did is made sure the camera was at the same temperature, and I put the cap on it so no light could get into it, and I did a 45-minute dark image. And so since there's no actual light coming in, any signal that was on that picture would just be the noise that had built up. And so then I took that image and subtracted it from my original image, and then voila, you have this much, much nicer image. So, even if you can't do, a good cooling on your camera, it's still, it's possible to do these deep sky photography with a DSLR. You just have to do some image calibration afterwards, which actually you have to do that even with a dedicated telescope camera. It's just not as severe as what you have with a DSLR.
All right, Matthew has what he calls the big question.
Oh.
Right now, the price of a new telescope is 50 to 200% higher than last year due to COVID affecting supply, as well as higher demand. Where's a good place to buy used quality telescopes?
This actually came up in our star party. The one thing that really there were two places that were mentioned. One was Astromart. That's where a lot of people put their used equipment on there. If I remember correctly, you may have to pay to join that site, but don't quote me on that. You may have to do some research on that. Cloudy Nights, I can't remember if it's cloudynights.com or .net. That's another great place where amateur astronomers will get together and discuss topics, or they'll put stuff up for sale. And there might be stuff on Craigslist or eBay, I'm not sure, but of course, that may not be more of a, I don't want to say reputable, but if you're going to someplace like Astromart or Cloudy Nights, that's more likely going to be, say, seasoned amateur astronomers who are upgrading their equipment. So they've got this other equipment, they know it very well, they can describe it very well. You basically know what you're getting for what you're paying for. So those are the two main places that I would go. There might be another, but I honestly cannot think of one off the top of my head. So I'd give those a shot, and I think that they would be your best bet.
Kyle asks, what kind of budget would you set for a beginner's telescope, but still an effective one?
So like I was mentioning before, if like the little 4.5-inch telescope, that's going to start probably a little over 100. Probably wouldn't get to 200. I think the 4-inch one, the taller one in the back there, that would get closer to 200 under normal pricing conditions, like we just had pointed out. If you're really just starting to wet your feet and you're not sure if this is the hobby that you want to go for, then I would say start out with one of those. If you can go up a little bit higher in budget, a 6-inch is going to that's going to gather almost 2 times as much light as what a 4.5-inch will gather. So you'll get a little bit of an improvement there. I would, if it was me, I would say start with a 6-inch. But if you're still not sure, especially if prices are higher, then the 4.5-inch, there's nothing wrong with that. Especially if if you just want to start looking at the moon or the planets or finding some double stars, or even if you've got decently dark locations, you'll be able to see some of these fainter objects like these nebulae. That might be a way to go, because you're not going to spend too terribly much at the beginning, and you can really see if this is kind of the thing that you, if this is really whetting your appetite. Or you may find that's, it's not really my thing. So then you're not going to be out that much money. So, but again, I would definitely go with one of the Dobsonian. If you went with a $100 refractor, then that's going to be a much smaller aperture, and you're not going to be able to see quite as good, especially when dealing with that chromatic aberration, which it's not a huge thing, but it can get kind of annoying at times, especially when you're looking at the moon or some of the planets. So hopefully that answers your question. There was something else that came up. Regarding the previous question about where to look for these used equipment, you can also try, like here, if you're here in Nashville, you can try contacting the Barnard Seaford Astronomical Society, because there may be members there that have, over the years, they've bought bigger and better telescopes, and now they're starting to get a collection, and they might be looking at possibly getting rid of one of theirs. Who knows?
That's it for viewer questions, but I have a question.
Okay.
It was when you're talking about eyepieces.
Yes.
The eyepieces that give you a larger field of view, does that affect the quality of the view at all? Would it be a lower resolution, or would it be comparable?
No, it would be very comparable. So you don't typically get these huge fields of view with a cheap eyepiece. It's gonna end up costing you, because you have to have a lot of optical elements. So like the let's see, where did it go? So this little Plössl, let me take this off. If I remember correctly, this one, it looks like 1, maybe 2 lenses in there. It's actually 4 lenses in there. But some of these really big eyepieces, like that large one that I showed, they can have 8 or 9, or I think there's even some that have even more of those to really widen the field of view, but you still retain that image quality. But yeah, if you ever get a chance to look through those, I mean, they're, especially at a dark sky location, they're really phenomenal. Because I mean, this one, I can get to about right, well, let me take my filter off. This little Plössl, I can get to about right here, and my my eyebrows just barely touching that, and I can see the edge of the field of view. But for those really nice ones, I mean, you get your eye right up to it, and you literally are just kind of moving around to see everything. It's really spectacular.
Well, I don't see any other questions. on here. Last call for questions.
And if you have one and you lost it, you know, we've got our contact link on our website, so please feel free to shoot us an email, and we will try to give you the best advice that we can.
Okay.
All right, so if there are no more questions, again, I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and again, be sure to stay tuned to our website for our upcoming events in December, because we've got 2 guest speakers that'll be doing talks in December. We have our star party at some point in December. That'll probably be, I want to say like the 3rd week, definitely before the holiday season. And then we do have a special viewing coming up around the I think it's on the 21st. So with that, again, thank you all for joining us, and thanks again to Alex Rockefeller, Helen Morissette, Nathan Griffin, and Brian Smokler for helping make this possible. And so hope to see you all next month, and if I don't, happy holidays.